just finish up on is, how do we become more of an optimist? So we talked about the virtues. We talked about longevity. People who are optimistic actually live longer. We talked about higher levels of success, higher levels of happiness, more likely to overcome depression. People who are optimistic are 8 times less likely to be depressed. They're much more likely to be happy. And again, optimism as an interpretation style, not as a Pollyannish feel-good kind of approach. So how do we become more of an optimist? And I want to talk about 3 techniques. First is to take action, to just do it, to put ourselves on the line. Second, I'm going to talk about the power of imagination, visualization. Many of you are familiar with it, especially athletes, as a technique, so we'll talk about that technique. And finally, cognitive therapy, which, at least according to research, is the most successful, most effective therapeutic intervention out there today. So we'll talk about some of the basics and summarize those. So let me begin with action. This is based on research by Albert Bandura. You read about self-efficacy. His concept, basically, the idea of having strong beliefs, and he just made it more academic, more scientific, and researched it for many years. And we talked about the many benefits of self-efficacy. What Bandura is coming out against in much of his work is what has become known as the self-esteem movement, or he's coming against what has become known as the feel-good movement. All right, so tell a child how great they are, how wonderful they are. Stand in front of a mirror every morning and tell yourself, hi gorgeous 10 times, and then you'll be more successful, your self-esteem will be higher, and you'll be more gorgeous. It doesn't work. Believe me, it doesn't work. I've tried everything. The thing, though, is that very often it actually hurts in the long term. It actually hurts self-esteem. It actually hurts the motivation of students who are constantly told you're wonderful, you're terrific, no matter what. And we'll talk about how we can be more discerning with praise, how we can praise in the right way when we talk about the work of Carol Dweck on mindset in a few weeks. But in the meantime, what Bandura showed, what Carol Dweck showed, what many others showed, was that it's not enough. Very often, it's even detrimental to just give the positive talk, the positive affirmation, whether it comes from the outside or from the inside. Maybe part of the equation, certainly can't be all. What Bandura is saying that rather than talk, we need action. We need to put hard work into whatever it is we want to be more confident about, and we need to cope. We need to put ourselves on the line. Very simple. Why? Because hard work and coping inevitably leads to success. More success, at least, than we had before when we didn't act and we didn't cope. So even if it's a little bit, that in and of itself contributes, that success contributes to our self-efficacy, to our self-confidence. And then that self-confidence in turn motivates us to work harder. We start to believe in ourselves more. Now, this is a very simple model. I mean, anyone, a 5-year-old could draw that model. However, think about the implications for our lives. Think about the implications for education. Do we just tell students constantly, you're terrific, you're wonderful, you're great? Or do we, like Marva Collins, make them actually work hard so that they succeed more, so that they see themselves, going back to self-perception theory, see themselves working hard, see themselves putting themselves on the line and coping and failing and getting up again? It works also in a similar way to our physical immune system. When we get sick, when we get ill, our body sends antibodies and we actually become immune to whatever it is that we had. So our body becomes immunized through failure. Same on the psychological level. Failure is underrated. One of the things that I wish for you, and I mean it genuinely, one of the things that I wish for you is that you fail more. I'm not saying it in jest, I really do. And coupled with that, I hope that when you fail, you will also learn to interpret it in a different way than most of us usually interpret failure. Because there is no other way to succeed. There is no other way for growth. It's an illusion that a life looks like this. And we'll talk about it much more when we talk about perfectionism. A healthy life, a real life, and a happy life ultimately looks like this. A spiral with ups and downs, not as a straight line. When we see ourselves cope, when we see ourselves work hard, we derive conclusions about ourselves. Our self-confidence goes up, our motivation goes up, our belief goes up, and so on in an upward spiral of growth. Soren Kierkegaard, to dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. Not to dare is to lose oneself. To lose one's footing temporarily is the failure that comes inevitably when we cope, when we try, when we have high expectations. Not to dare is to lose oneself. That is when we don't cope, when we avoid. Because this model also works the other way around. When we constantly avoid challenges, when we constantly shun difficult experiences, when we don't give ourselves the permission to fail, a downward spiral is created in terms of our self-esteem, in terms of our success, in terms of our well-being. Second technique, imagining success. Now, there's one thing I want to share with you. I'm a little bit nervous about sharing it, but I'll do it anyway. Since we've opened up, I think especially last time was a real milestone in our relationship. So I'm going to tell you something, but please don't tell anyone. Especially don't tell any of my clients or potential clients in the future. I get really nervous before lectures. I get very nervous. In fact, for me, whenever I stand in front of a large audience, there are butterflies in my stomach. And it's very difficult for me. When I talk about large audience, it's anything above 5. So this is a real challenge, and it's a real challenge when I talk to clients. And this has been a challenge since the day I decided that I wanted to be a teacher. And I decided that I wanted to be a teacher when I heard of Marva Collins. And I said, this is my calling. And here is what happened then. I said, how can I be a successful teacher, an effective teacher, if I get so nervous when I stand in front of an audience? And remember the 3 components of success, the secret of success. It was optimism, belief in oneself. It was passion, loving what you do, and it was hard work. So I had 2 of the 3 components. I worked extremely hard. In fact, my motto has become one that I got from Professor Richard Hackman, who was my thesis advisor as an undergrad here. And what he said, he's a phenomenal teacher, and what he says when he goes into a classroom is the following: prepare, 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 and then be spontaneous. So I followed his advice. I read over my notes, I have all the notes written down, and then I can let go. So I prepare a lot. I have the hard work, not a problem. I have the passion. I love learning. It's the most important thing professionally in my life. But I lacked the third thing. I lacked optimism and I lacked confidence. And then I asked myself, so how can I raise this third component? Because it is an important component of well-being. Remember when the research on athletes, 56% of the variance of success is accounted for by the sense of optimism or belief in yourself. Remember the John Kotter study, 20 years longitudinal, looking at Harvard Business School graduates. One of the 2 components that differentiated the most successful from the rest, one of them was belief in themselves, confidence. It's an important component of success, and I lacked that. So what did I do? I went back and thought about what happened when I played squash, or what my coaches used to teach me, and that was visualization. And I started reading up on it, looking at the literature, and there's a lot of research on it. It actually started off centuries ago in religious practices, was brought to athletics through Eastern European athletes who would imagine themselves, say, running around the track and then standing on the podium receiving the gold medal. And and more psychologists started to implement it. Salespeople use it very effectively, seeing themselves actually striking the deal, going through with it, doing it, succeeding. And that made it much more likely to come true. The question is why? What's the mechanism behind visualization? Why is it so important? Why is it so good? Why is it so effective? Why is it being used so widely and successfully? And the answer goes back to the structure of our brains. This is research done by the head of the psychology department, Professor Stephen Coslin. What he shows was that when we see something, so let's say I'm looking at my hand right now, there are certain neurons in my brain that are firing, that actually take on the shape of this hand, my visual cortex, the back. Now, if I close my eyes and imagine that I'm looking at this hand, even if it's not there, if I imagine that I look at this hand, the exact same neurons are firing. In other words, my brain does not know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. Which explains why dreams can be so vivid. In the middle of the night, pitch dark, and you're dreaming about middle of the day, walking around the yard. Our imagination, at least for the brain, is no different than the real thing. Now, when I imagine success, what happens in a sense is that I'm creating a simulator for my mind. And I'm, in a sense, fooling my mind into thinking that this is the real thing. My mind doesn't know the difference between the two. Subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. Now, if I imagine success over and over again in my mind, remember, what the mind does not like is inconsistency. In other words, if I create success in my imagination and I persist with it, not just visualize it once or twice, but over and over again, the mind doesn't like inconsistencies, and therefore it will bring up the external reality to match this internal schema. Why? Because the mind doesn't know the difference in the real thing and the imaginary thing. Just like Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile, and after that, what happened was that everyone had a different schema. Oh, 4-minute mile is possible, and 37 runners run it. Over 300 runners run it the following year. Because they had a different schema, we can do exactly the same thing through the simulator. Because the mind doesn't know the difference between the real thing and the imaginary thing. Doesn't work all the time, doesn't work 100% of the time, but it works a great deal. What I do every time when I give a lecture is visualize. I imagine myself standing in front of the audience, calm, excited, passionate, and then when I go into the real thing, now I don't know if this is the real thing or I'm imagining, but I'm assuming it's the real thing. When I go into the real thing, I do feel that. I still get nervous, I still get anxious, but it's a healthy excitement. Raising my levels of belief, levels of confidence by practicing. Just like a pilot you would hope would practice in a simulator before they take you on across the Atlantic. The mind as a simulator. This is why it works. The key here, this is a mistake that many people make, whether it's in athletics or whether it's in a lot of the self-help books that talk about visualization. The key is to focus not just on the destination. Shelley Taylor, UCLA, did this research where she divided students into two random groups. One student imagined themselves getting an A on the exam and imagined it over and over again. The second group imagined themselves getting an A, but also saw themselves work and persist in the library, prepare for it, and then get to that final A. The second group that imagined both the journey and the destination was much more successful, much better result in the exam. So visualize the journey as well as the destination. This is your response paper for this week. To visualize both your destination of getting there, your journey of getting there, as well as the destination itself. Arguably the most, or certainly one of the most influential speeches of all time was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream.